Welcome to the podcast Change Leaders, sponsored by the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. Our guest this week is Howard Guttman. Howard M. Guttman is principal of Guttman Development Strategies, Inc., a Mount Arlington, New Jersey-based management consulting firm founded in 1989 and specializing in building horizontal, high-performance teams, strategic and organizational alignment, leadership coaching, and leadership development. Guttman Development Strategies has worked with a wide range of public and privately held clients in the U.S. and internationally. Guttman Development Strategies focuses on aligning senior management teams, developing the strategy and implementation of horizontal organizations, and executive development. Howard Guttman and his staff of consultants are known for creating programs and processes that are pragmatic, result-oriented, and produce observable change. Howard Guttman is the author of Great Business Teams, Cracking the Code for Standout Performance, named one of the top business books of 2008 by Soundview Executive Book Summaries. He is also the author of When Goliaths Clash, Managing Executive Conflict to Build a More Dynamic Organization. And his third book, Coach Yourself to Win, 7 Steps to Breakthrough Performance on the Job and in Your Life, was published by McGraw-Hill in October 2010 and named to the Washington Post list of top 5 business books for April 2011. Howard Guttman holds an MS from the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. This episode is hosted by Robert Fisher, the Grace Longwell Coyle Professor in Civil Society at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences.
Welcome. My name is Rob Fisher. I'm a professor at the Jack Joseph Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. And I want to welcome Howard Guttman, who is an esteemed alum of our school and is the founder and principal of Guttman Development Strategies. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you.
Well, Howard, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And from what I have seen of you and what I know of you, you've had a really diverse career that's crossed both the nonprofit sector and consulting for major corporations. So I wonder if you could just take us back to your time at Case Western Reserve and give us a little flavor of what influenced your initial career path.
Sure. At the time I went to Case Western, I was out of college for about 4 years, and I was working at a major nonprofit in New Jersey. So I went to Case Western essentially to get a degree, I thought at the time, like in library science, because I was working in the world of museums, and I thought that libraries could be a great base of community organization work.
Sure.
So when I went there, my practicum was at the Cleveland Public Library, and they wanted me to do a needs analysis of the Cleveland's West Side, which was fascinating. As I was doing it, though, it started to dawn on me that I really didn't have skills on how you really do a needs assessment of a large community. And so I posed to the dean at the time at the library science school. I said, how about if I get a dual degree and go to the School of Applied Social Sciences so I can gain skills in community analysis? And so he thought it was a great idea. I then met with the dean of the School of Applied Social Sciences, whose name was Terry Hockenstadt. That rings a bell.
That's right. Yep. Terry.
And he thought it was a great idea. And so that's what I did. And I would say right off the bat, the 2 things that immediately helped me were, 1, understanding stakeholders. How do you assess organizations, and in this case, also broad communities? And then finally, how do you actually deal with data collection with a diverse group of folks? So there was a real tie-in at the time around School of Applied Social Sciences and what I learned there and how I was able to apply it in that initial project with Cleveland Public Library.
But it sounds to me like on the library science side, you were an unconventional sort. You never really we're seeking to do the card catalog and reference, but maybe we're seeing the library as a important third space.
Yes, I was living in a world of delusion, Rob. And so my picture of what I was going to be doing in a library is not what they thought I'd be doing in a library. So I saw it as community outreach. But when I took my first course on like, I think it was on like a reference librarian, I thought I got married to the wrong woman. So frankly, the School of Applied Social Sciences really became my focus. That was the last time literally I did anything to do with libraries, but it did bring me to SAS. And so for that, I was grateful. And frankly, that's what I found the fun. So to me, you see, my orientation was really at the time community outreach, community development. How do you meet needs of a diverse community? And so my orientation of having a library be like a basis of that was a good, philosophically, it makes a lot of sense. But that's
Yeah.
not where the game was really going. So I very quickly, and I ultimately did get a degree in library science, but my focus really at Case Western was in the School of Applied Social Sciences. That's really what I was focusing on.
Now, these days at SAS, we have community practice for social change as a concentration, but back then, did you find a home in taking kind of administration courses, or did you kind of have a mixed bag of coursework that you pursued?
Well, at the time, like, Hockenstadt as the dean and Professor Yankee were very
Hmm.
instrumental in my work. And so we created something that was like a hybrid and actually very well customized. So
Uh,
not only did I work at Cleveland Public, but then I started working for something at the time, I don't know if it exists anymore, called GCNCA. I remember the acronym, Greater Cleveland Neighborhood Centers Association.
yes,
And I
right.
was doing needs analysis for settlement houses all throughout Cleveland. I also did needs assessments for the VA hospital. I did needs assessments in the Huff community. So
Hmm.
I really got very heavily involved in like large scale work in terms of identifying needs of constituents. And so Yankee was a real mentor of mine at the time, and I loved the work. So, to me, that's really set me on my path.
Well, John Yankees had an enduring influence at the school over many years, now as an emeritus professor, but still
Sure.
heavily engaged. So I'm glad to hear of your story with him.
Yeah.
So after you finished, I understand you worked for Johnson and Johnson and around the same time in ADP, but I wanted to get to kind of the intersection of social work and business because, frankly, many of our students, they see themselves, I think two-thirds go into nonprofit organizations, a third go into government, a few into private sector entities that are in the for-profit space. Many don't even think about business as a potential place of influence. And one of the things you have always emphasized is emotional intelligence as a key leverage feature. So I wonder if you could talk about how did your social work exposure and what you brought to your learning kind of bring you to that important conclusion?
Well, so when I graduated from Case Western, I went back to the nonprofit that I was working, which was the New Jersey Historical Society.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, to make a long story short, because of my knowledge of Case Western, I started doing needs analysis for various organizations. The PR firm for the Historic Society had corporate clients. So they started hiring me on the side to do needs assessments for corporations. And I
Mm.
really found it fascinating because up until that time, I never set foot in corporations. I was very much a product of the 70s, being very nonprofit oriented, social work. Corporations were like anathema to me. So as I started doing that work, I started saying, wow, this is really fascinating. And what I got from the social work school, very dramatically, was a sense of process, a sense of how do you really go from looking at superficial needs to what's going on underneath. And what I found, I was at ADP, Automatic Data Processing. Fortunately, I had a mentor at the time, Bernie Kessler, who came from education. And my colleagues were people who came from social work and psychology. So it was like very unorthodox at the time. And I was there for about 2.5 years, was like getting an advanced degree. Then from there, I went to J&J. But to answer your question specifically, process skills, understanding people, understanding when do you hold them or fold them. I mean, EQ wasn't a term people used at the time.
Right,
But the
right.
reality is that most of the people in the field of, I was in management and organization development work, came from much more of a traditional by rote practice. They understood organizational design, organization structure, metrics, IO psychologists. But in
Hmm.
terms of the human factor, being able to actually provide coaching, process skills, etc., that was a gray area. And the field was really emerging at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. So I started to realize that, wow, I had a really an interesting niche. And frankly, the organizations, the corporations that I worked on found me to be like this unusual hybrid. And so when you go back now to J&J, which I went after ADP, I came in as the national manager of training and development. I was 31, 30 years old, and started initially things like the Live for Life program, employee assistance. And
Yeah.
then there was in New Jersey at the time, I started the social worker in industry practice.
Hmm.
So I guess what I'm saying to you, Rob, is that unfortunately, many social workers put themselves in a box. And as you said, it's either I go down the nonprofit route or I work in government, but they have a very clear picture of what a social worker is and is not. I essentially carved this other path. And frankly, now in my own consulting company, I have three other people who have ACSWs. So there's definitely a space for social workers, but they don't tend to have a line of sight to it as a viable landing spot. That would be my take.
That's really helpful. Could you give us a quick thumbnail sketch of the firm, which you now, what's 35 years since you
35
founded?
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, we do three things. The first thing, if you Google me or the firm, we develop high performing teams in companies around the world. Basically, a high performing team is a team that works horizontally, interdependently, rather than a leader centric, siloed hub and spoke. So over the years, we've worked with things ranging from Johnson and Johnson, Mars, L'Oreal, Procter and Gamble, as well as huge nonprofits.
Mm.
Whether it be the YMCA, the Boy Scouts, and we work in higher education, whether it be like Rutgers, Princeton, etc. So we're agnostic. Wherever there's an organization, we work. We do a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Mars will buy Wrigley. Bain does the financials. We integrate the players. Keurig buys Dr. Pepper. We create the new senior executive team. The second leg is we do executive coaching. We coach over 100 executives around the world. Typically, they're strong technically, and we help them in terms of how they manage conflict, how they deal with resistance to change, how they negotiate differences. Again, all EQ human factor stuff. We do a lot of
Hmm.
work accelerating high potential talent. And then finally, we teach skills. How do you influence without authority, conflict resolution, strategic thinking, decision making? So we be seen in the marketplace as a best in class organization development firm. And we have an eclectic group of consultants. In the marketplace, we have like a very interesting niche because the Bains, the McKinsey, the BCGs, they focus on strategy and the financials and the
Yeah.
structure. That's not us. We're always looking at the how. How does the game work? How do the players fit in? So, this whole concept of creating high performance organizations, meaning organizations that work horizontally rather than, I said, like leader centric siloed, it's an EQ game. You presume people have the technical skills, but if they can't influence without authority, if they can't manage differences,
Right.
it's not going to work. And what I'm saying is like, so going back to what we said earlier, social workers and the skills that they get are absolutely applicable to what I'm talking about. Now, I'm a living, breathing example of that, but they're unconsciously incompetent, meaning they are not
Mm.
aware that there's even a world that exists out there that could be a purveyor of their services. They don't know. And again, I think part of it is just simply that there's been a traditional paradigm of what does it mean to be a social worker and what do social work schools deliver. When I met the dean I loved it because I saw he's a disruptor and he's willing to really push the boundaries. So we immediately hit it off. And frankly, I think there's a great opportunity here to kind of like rebrand what people can gain from going to a school like SAS.
Aside from the career opportunity, what would be your pitch to a social worker who has a heart for service and you're telling them you could have this tremendous influence on corporations? How do you bridge their natural inclination to think of the child, the family, the neighborhood versus an organization?
Yeah, well, and it's a great question. Look, the reality here is we make a tremendous difference and have a tremendous impact on people's lives. And being in the corporate world is not a piece of cake.
No.
I mean, competitive advantage is fleeting. There's constant pressure, constant stress. And so, in many cases, when we do our executive coaching, we're really processing look, let's put it this way. It crosses boundaries where three-dimensionally you're teaching people how to listen, how to deal with resistance, how to deal with differences, how to have challenging conversations, how to get their needs met without being too aggressive, how to contract with one another. These are all very much like EQ, human factor things. And you come away knowing that you've really changed people's lives. And frankly, what we always hear from our clients is these skills are transferable obviously into their home life.
Mm-hmm.
So when we work in nonprofits, we're working with people who are primarily mission driven. I get it. But obviously, in a lot of the corporations, they are too. People working in pharma, they believe in the drugs and what they're doing to help populations. But the problem in most nonprofits that we experience is you're dealing many times with leaders who are mission driven, care very deeply about their constituents, but from a leadership standpoint, are unconscious. So whether it be how do you hold people accountable? How do you provide feedback? How do you actually manage stakeholders? That's not where their orientation is. So when we go into nonprofits, it really takes them to a different place. You find I would say that in a lot of now again, I'm making broad generalizations, but the reality here is when you work in the profit center, what I have found though is that there's an imperative. It's like survival. You'd better get your act together. You'd better deal if you're in marketing with the R&D person because you have no choice. Many times in nonprofits, people tend to disengage and choose to be conflict adverse because they care deeply about the relationships. But many times we go into nonprofits and we do our assessment, which we do very quickly to get a lay of the land. It's really fascinating. In most nonprofits, the 1 to 5 Likert scales in terms of people's perception of the working atmosphere is always very high. The 1 to 5 Likert scales in terms of their ability to deal with conflict is always very low.
Yeah.
They have these disingenuous relationships under the guise of like we get along, we're familial, but they're not straight. And so the first battle is to get people to be able to put their cards on the table in a straightforward manner and make the relationship work. So I guess what I'm saying is if you really strip it away, if you want to be a player and make a difference, whether it be in a profit or nonprofit, you're going to have to challenge the status quo. And every time you challenge the status quo, you are going to be ruffling people's feathers. So the question is, can you ruffle feathers, have the difficult conversations, and still preserve the relationship? That's the game, whether you're in higher ed, profit center, nonprofit. But what I'm saying is, in a lot of the profit center, they have no choice but to have those conversations. Many times in nonprofits, they're under the illusion that it's an option.
I was partly interested in your answer to that because as chair of the master's program in nonprofit management here, a lot of students in social work, if you start talking about an organization, they say, well, I want to help people.
Yeah, right.
I'm not interested in the organization. And it's almost, to their own detriment. It's like, well, the organization is a vehicle to address community needs, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. And so if you want it to be sustainable, effective, successful on various dimensions, there's a lot of influence that could be had there at the organization.
Completely. And see, that's why I said when I met Dexter, I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting. There are maybe some things we could bring to the party at the School of Applied Social Sciences that would also be a very big competitive advantage for the school because the needs are out there. The needs are really out there. And I will tell you right now that, when we do our work with the individuals, the reality is that it opens up doors for them and ways of thinking that prior to that time they many times never really explored. And I'll give you a great example,
Mm.
okay? Just this past week, we were working with a construction company, $500 million construction company. And the senior team tended to be fairly conflict adverse. So what we explored with them at a certain juncture is what were the core limiting beliefs they had, i.e., the concerns or the fears that rendered them incapable of having authentic conversations with their colleagues. Now, that's not something that a Boston Consulting Group or a McKinsey or a Bain would ever have those type of conversations with them. But yet the reality is without getting that level of authenticity, how are they going to really drive decision making? How are they
Right.
going to speed up their ability to really make a difference in the marketplace? So all of this stuff that we deal with, this human factor stuff in terms of trust, the relationships, the ability for people to be candid, to be receptive, et cetera, that's what enables the organization to function. And excuse me, if someone's mission driven, but they're dysfunctional in the way they engage with people, it really doesn't matter a damn. It's just happy talk.
A lot of leaders will quote Peter Drucker's line about culture eats strategy for breakfast. But when it comes down to it, there's a comfort in saying something is strategy versus emotional intelligence, which seems like that's personal. Strategy is organizational, emotional intelligence is personal. And it reflects on me as a leader, as a collaborator. Are the companies that come to you, the organizations, have they already kind of exhausted their belief in strategy? They've realized that strategy is not delivering sufficiently and they have to go a different route? Or are they leaders that already know this has to happen?
I would say in many cases they're consciously incompetent.
Ah,
Or the fact that the game is not working. They're in a very challenging marketplace. The category may be declining, or there's a major change that's occurring, or there's a
uh-huh.
merger acquisition that's going to happen, or they're experiencing a lot of turnover in their company, or the senior team is at one another's throats. There is some compelling issue which sends a message that we need to handle this. And so going back to the point that you said, if you're buttoned up strategically and on paper, financially, you know what you need to do, but you've got dysfunctional organization where people aren't talking to one another, or they're going underground, or there's passive aggressive modalities occurring. The
Hmm.
reality here is that it's not going to work. So I tend to think of it like the companies bring us on because they see us as expert in the how the game needs to be played, how people need to interact, which ultimately accelerates the ability to handle the what. So the firms like the McKinseys, the Bains, the BCGs deal with the what, right? We deal with the how. We're process. So we're industry agnostic. So one day I could be with a construction company, next day I could be with a food company, next day health and beauty, next day higher education. But it's still all organizations. So it's looking at organizations like puzzle pieces and attempting to figure out what are the linchpins that prop up the game. And then what we do many times is we'll work with the senior team. Then we'll cascade down. Our focus is always the top two levels in an organization, whether it be profit or nonprofit. Because ultimately, if you want to shift the game, it's the top two tiers. There's not enough people at the senior level. That's like the
Mm.
Alamo, right? You're going to get overwhelmed. But it's the senior team in the next level, the multi-tier group, like two tiers, two levels. That group of 40 to about 100 people in a place like a Walmart, that's what makes or breaks the game. So that's our emphasis everywhere we go on the planet Earth. That's what we focus on, the top two levels. So going back to, what I said earlier around like social workers, so you're dealing here with process issues, you're dealing with resistance. It's all human factor stuff. Many times working, when they work with like, the big consulting companies, that's not their orientation. They don't deal with that stuff. In fact, one of the reasons they don't deal with it is because it's very much a high wire act. If you're working with the senior team in the company and you blow it, you're done. You could lose like a $1 million account. But if you're good at it, then they really want to cascade down the organization. And we happen to be very good at what we do. But you have to be three-dimensional. So that's why going back to like this gig that just occurred this week, when somebody was talking about the fact that people don't necessarily follow through with him. They say they're going to do something and they don't, classic stuff. And I said to him, well, what part do you play in that? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, this isn't happening in a vacuum. If what you're telling me is that you're trying to deal with colleagues and they're not keeping their agreements with you, they're not, their word isn't good. I'm saying, what part are you playing in enabling them to be dysfunctional? What's that about? That's where we go. Now, you're not going to have like somebody from McKinsey do stuff. They're not going to talk like that.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying when I think about like social work education, teaching people how to consult in organizations, just like even as like a little certificate program, but taking them to a different level and changing the paradigm that they're still doing the good work and they're just dealing in a different domain. But frankly, the same skills need to be applied in nonprofit or anywhere. It's just that, as I said, the world of business, the world of corporations is seen as like, in many cases, like anathema. And I remember when I started getting into the field and I started working in corporations, I remember I had more than a few friends say to me, well, like you're selling out, it's a money play. And I said, well, that doesn't make me bad, does it? I said, corporations have needs too. They're people too, aren't they? I mean, let's be sarcastic about it.
I want to connect where you started, which was your kind of deep experience on doing community needs assessment. And now in your work with teams and companies, give us a flavor of what the method looks like for you to actually do the needs assessment of a team or an organization. What are you actually doing?
So when we go into an organization, our goal is to create them to be this high performance, horizontal organization. But you can't just go on and do things. You can't, that's like shtick. It's not like here's the roadmap. So we collect data.
Yeah.
This is our IP on high performance teams. So it's about 10 to 13 questions benchmarking the team as an HPT, as a high performing team. Looking at clarity of goals, clarity of interdependencies, conflict, decision making, to get like a picture. It's either 1 to 5 Likert scales or open-ended questions. And then many times what we'll do is focus groups at the level below. But the first point is to get an accurate picture. Because minus that picture, we have no power. Even though many times intuitively I can pick up what probably will come back to us, but you got to have the data. The data is crucial. And so going back to when we started, when I think about it, that's what I was doing at Cleveland Public Library 40 years ago. So when we go in, it's basically, we do an overview of about 90 minutes for the senior team and the next level, where the leader conveys why they want to go down this road. And then we explain, this is what a high performance team looks like. This is the process, blah, blah, blah. And we keep it very interactive. Next step is to collect data, individual interviews and focus groups. Next step is to feed it back to the client, the leader. Then the first gig is with the senior team, and then we begin to cascade, presuming the senior team's okay. But if the senior team is dysfunctional, we can't cascade. So that's essentially the process we employ. And I would tell you honestly, 9.5 out of 10, we always move the game ahead, but we qualify the client. In order to create a high performance organization, There are six factors. It's like the secret sauce. You got
Yeah.
to have a client that's committed.
Mm.
You got to have players who are coachable, right, with the right mindset. I could get into that more if you want. We've got to provide people with skills. How do you influence that authority? How do you manage conflict? How do you hold peers accountable? You got to change the system so that comp and performance management rewards people for those behaviors. You have got to create ways of working that you can cascade, like decision making, conflict resolution, communications. And then finally, the top two levels have to play. So anytime we go in generically, we know that's the secret sauce. We really know how to do it. I mean, we always do it. But this key question, though, Rob, is whether or not you got coachable players.
Yeah, I definitely want to ask a little bit more on that one. It's fascinating to me that so you get these data back and you're kind of holding up a mirror to the team saying, here's what we see in you, in your operation. And you've got the vantage point of having worked with many other organizations. So you kind of fit them into a landscape. You get them bought in. Those six features that you just talked about, it seems like a number of them are about how we play together. We agree to use certain methods. But on this coachable player item, if you identify people who are problematic in the team, choke points or friction points, how do you, before you cascade down to beyond the senior team, how do the executive coaching part of your work fit into the team consulting?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, the odds, if you think about it realistically, the odds of going into any organization, profit, not profit, doesn't matter. Let's say like 10 people on a senior team. And to think everybody's camera ready, everybody's coachable, that lives in like the world of fantasy. It's probably 8 out of 10 times I look in the room and I go, this one's okay, this one's a question mark. They got to get rid of that one. Now, the reality here is you got to have a critical mass of people to move the game ahead. But we'll then have a conversation with the client off the record. And the question then is going to be, is it worth their while for us to provide coaching to that individual? There are essentially four types of players. You got the players who are getting the business results and they're exhibiting the cultural norms you want, and their future is assured. That's what you want, right?
Okay.
Then you got people who aren't getting the results and they're not living the norms of the culture, and their future is assured too. You just eliminate them.
Other
Then you
extreme.
got individuals who aren't getting the results, but they're exhibiting the norms that you want in the organization, and you got to give them another shot. But the toughest nut to crack, I would say the toughest issue for any leader I ever deal with, including myself, is when you have people who are getting the results, but they're not exhibiting the cultural norms. Like from sports, right? You've got somebody who's a great scorer in basketball, but they're toxic in the locker room. I
Right.
mean, what the hell do you do? I mean, and that's the killer. That's the toughest nut to crack. So I will tell you that when I have conversations with clients, and probably the main area where we debate is I can smell these things miles and miles away. And usually the biggest debate we have is I think somebody needs to go. And then there's a lot of consternation. In fact, I was in a bar a couple of months ago with a client, and they have a person, head of sales, who's toxic, really toxic,
Mm.
misogynist. They create havoc in the organization, but their biggest customer loves them, loves that person.
Mm.
And so
Uh-huh.
we're in the bar, and he's talking to me. He said, sometimes I feel like I sold my soul. And I said, you did. You did sell your soul. I said, because at best, people in the organization are going to feel like you don't see it. So at best, you're blind. You're unconscious. At worst, you do see it and you collude with it. So your values are suspect. So at
Mm.
best, you're blind. At worst, you're, I'm not going to say the word, so I don't want to get bleeped out. I said, but so if you look at it in that light, it's like, the work we do, the world that we inhabit as a consulting firm, we're always doing these fascinating issues of when do you hold them, when do you fold them. So going back to
Right.
the earlier premise, A social worker is going to have a far better understanding of how to do that, at least intrinsically, than somebody who is a consultant who's coming place of like from finance. You know what I mean? It's like not even a question. That's why there's a place for what we do. There's a place for firms like mine. And that's why we try to attract people who have that EQ. And that's where the opportunity is, in my mind, for, social workers. And that's why, like I said, I'm excited to kind of like re-engage again with my alma mater, because I think there are some fascinating opportunities here to move the game ahead.
So the biggest problem is the player who's not following the norms, but they're high performing. And is the biggest opportunity then the player who's following the norms and underperforming? Is that the one that where we could potentially get the most additional value on the team?
Yes. But ultimately, again, if you're talking somebody who, let's say, is in sales, that's like the classic. You got this salesperson who's very aggressive and they're hitting it out of the park in the marketplace. Or in the nonprofit world, I can think of this person who's a great fundraiser, great fundraiser.
Yeah.
But in the organization, they wreak havoc. And it's like it's the same analogy actually. And it's like, what the hell do you do? And many times, like and I can think of a nonprofit example. Again, all these clients remain nameless. Just a couple of years ago, and talking to the chairman of the board of this major nonprofit, and this woman was a fundraiser, great fundraiser, and the funding sources loved her, but she was terrible in the organization. And the chairman went like, "Oh God, this is under my watch, and I can't get rid of her because what the hell is going to happen?" Those are tricky scenarios, and those are the things that we're getting paid to deal with all the time. That's challenging work. It's very provocative work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know you're not naming names here, but on your website, you have this tremendous catalog of case studies that really bring out this idea of high performing teams. And I hope that some of our listeners will take advantage of going a little deeper on those, and certainly your writings on this topic. I want to turn our attention to, you've made some comments about social workers, how they view themselves, potential influence they could have. What would be your guidance to folks who are, maybe it did occur to them to think about consulting or being engaged with business partners? I mean, what would you say to them as they try to facilitate that growth in themselves?
I'd say a couple things. One is to look to opportunities to start to expand their horizons. And when I say expand their horizons, whether in books or other courses, they've got to get a feel for, that new world. So whether it be books that I've written, or books you mentioned, Drucker, or Peter Block, the great consultant. I mean, I can think of, so start to just get a different level of consciousness. I also would look for opportunities in terms of field work, to get field work that actually crosses the boundaries where they're no longer going like just into a traditional space. And then the third thing I would say, I would look to network. I would talk to people in my constellation and start talking to people who are living in a world that I don't necessarily play in. So somebody who, let's say, is in a consumer company or in a beauty company or in high tech, and start getting some understanding of what is that world like? What are the issues they face? So I'm saying expand their educational horizons, start to network, right? And try to find field experience that can start to push the envelope for them. And as I said, it's just kind of ironic that I was doing field work in the nonprofit world that suddenly was germane in the profit sector, although I didn't know that because I had no understanding of the profit sector back when I started, right? So now to think about the fact that I am doing things that I learned at Case Western many years ago, and in the profit sector, they're looking at it like it's Brave New World. Fascinating, you know?
Well, it seems like one of the things early on that all your work on doing needs assessment, you were delivering results to leadership teams and those who were trying to make sense of where the organization. So I mean, you were in a way, you were already getting exposure to folks that needed to make important decisions and getting a vantage point on
Yeah,
that.
and I also was holding up a mirror and understanding that sometimes people didn't always like the reflection.
Yeah.
I remember doing work at Case Western in the Huff area of Cleveland, and the people I had to hold up the mirror to were local politicians.
Mm.
And they were not happy with the outcome of my data collection because it cast them in a very bad light because the message was they weren't getting the job done. Early on, it was that issue of, wow, that's interesting. I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm telling them what exactly is, but the fact of the matter is you start getting conscious of, do you really have a client? What part does that client need to play in creating the outcome they profess to want? So early on, by, getting, knocked down and, can feel I started to get understand, like, how do you line up the ducks? How do you make it work? And that's fascinating stuff. I mean, it really is.
It really is. It definitely takes a special type of person as a consultant, to come in and run these diagnostics on teams and then speak truth about what's
Yeah,
there. Because
exactly. That's exactly right. But Rob, that's also why it doesn't get old. It's also
yeah,
why it's exciting because I can't go into an organization and feel like I've been there and done that. Although there's never something that I haven't seen before. But the fact is, it's a different milieu. It's a different culture. You're dealing with different people. So you can't play it out like it's a cookie cutter process. You've got to
mm,
call an audible and go where you got to go. And that's what makes this work fascinating. And that's also why the companies pay a lot of money for it.
mm. So Howard, I've asked you a lot of questions. I want to see if there's anything I haven't asked you about that you definitely wanted to share in our conversation.
No, actually, I've enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. At this stage of my career, I'm looking for ways to somehow add value at Case Western and look at ways we can really like start to move this game ahead because I'm excited about it.
Well, it strikes me that, in the marketplace for social work education, which has boomed over the last since the 70s, now several hundred universities offering MSWs.
Right.
That puts a lot of pressure on individual institutions to be
Absolutely.
competitive, but also thinking not about conventional social work, but
Exactly.
broader influence for social work is another pathway to growing the pie
Right.
of where social work can be.
Right. But in meeting, like I said, Dexter and meeting yourself, I mean, it feels like there's an appetite at the school to really try to push boundaries. And I think that's exciting. But frankly, in the world we're in right now, Rob, I mean, it's like, there's no plan B. Like, what's the other option?
Well, we know what we've gotten from the old methods. So
Exactly.
I love the way you talk about teams and how we can get them to a higher performing state. So I want to thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for making time for this. Look forward to more engagement and seeing where you go.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Howard.